The receptionist looked down at Maya's ID with a sneer and snapped. "This suite isn't for you," her voice sharp enough to cut the air, while a smug manager folded his arms behind the desk, both of them blind to the truth that in just 10 minutes, Maya would fire their entire staff of 150. Before I go deeper into this story, where are you watching from? Comment below, hit like, and subscribe to help share stories of justice and hope. Now, let us step into this moment. A moment that began as humiliation, but would turn into a lesson the world would never forget. Maya Johnson walked into the polished lobby of Lux Inn in Manhattan with nothing more than a carry-on bag and the calm presence of a woman who had worked through the night. She had just stepped off a long flight, dressed in a plain blouse and dark jeans, her hair tied back neatly, her face showing quiet strength rather than glamour. To anyone else, she might have looked like a tired traveler searching for rest, but to Emily Thompson, the young receptionist at the front desk, Maya was nothing more than an interruption. Emily glanced at the ID, wrinkled her nose, and tossed the paper back as if it were contaminated. "This is a luxury property, ma'am," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Budget inns are down the street. Maybe you'd feel more comfortable there." The words carried across the marble lobby, and heads turned, guests waiting in line whispering to each other, some with smirks tugging at their lips. Maya held her ground, calmly. She reached into her bag and pulled out the printed confirmation for a suite priced at $1,200 a night. She laid it on the counter with steady hands, her eyes steady, her tone polite. "This is my booking," she said, but Emily didn't even glance down. With a smirk, she tore the paper clean in half, letting the pieces fall onto the counter. "Must be a glitch," she replied coldly. "Our system shows no record of you. This suite isn't meant for you." Guests gasped. A man in a tailored suit chuckled under his breath. Another woman shook her head in disbelief, whispering, "She doesn't belong here." The humiliation was deliberate, and Emily reveled in it. For Maya, the sting of those words pulled her back years. She remembered the first landlord in Harlem who refused to rent her a tiny one-bedroom, telling her she didn't fit the profile. She remembered the nights she spent on a worn couch, building her business plan for a bed and breakfast that would one day become the seed of her empire. She remembered the voices of doubters telling her that a black woman could never run a hospitality group. And she remembered the vow she made to herself, that she would never again let prejudice silence her, never again allow humiliation to define her place. She had built her fortune brick by brick, hotel by hotel, quietly amassing power while others laughed. That vow burned inside her now as she faced the sneering receptionist. Robert Klein, the manager on duty, stepped forward. His suit was sharp, his tone sharper. "We have standards here," he said loudly, making sure every guest within earshot heard his words. "This isn't welfare housing. Our occupancy rate is 95%, and we won't let you disrupt our service." Emily crossed her arms, satisfied to see her superior standing by her side. Together, they created a wall of disdain. Robert pointed toward the door. "Leave now, or we'll call security." The murmurs in the lobby grew louder, a mix of amusement and discomfort. Some guests nodded in agreement, others looked uneasy, but remained silent. Maya's chest rose and fell, but her expression didn't crack. She recited calmly, "Under New York law, I have the right to access services without discrimination. Your refusal is unlawful." Emily's eyes narrowed. "You're disrupting paying guests. You need to go." Among the crowd stood Sarah Wilkins, a middle-aged woman from Boston, waiting with her suitcase. Her brows furrowed as she watched the scene unfold. Quietly, she slipped her phone out of her purse and began recording. Her hand trembled slightly, but her resolve was firm. She had seen discrimination before, but the cruelty in Emily's voice struck a nerve. Her camera lens caught every sneer, every insult, every dismissive wave of the manager's hand. Sarah's heart raced as she thought. People need to see this. At a smaller desk in the corner, Carlos Ramirez, a young intern in his first week at Luxin, glanced nervously at the scene. He knew the rules. Staff weren't supposed to intervene, but something inside him shifted when he saw Maya's steady gaze. When their eyes met, he gave a subtle nod, almost invisible, but enough. Maya caught it, a signal, a quiet promise that not everyone inside this place was blind. She returned a slight smile, just enough for Carlos to see. Robert motioned toward the back. "Security will handle this," he said with finality. Emily leaned forward, her lips curling into a smile that dripped with triumph. "You don't belong here. You never will." She turned back to the computer, dismissing Maya as if she were invisible. But Maya was far from defeated, beneath her calm exterior. She had already begun moving pieces on a chessboard no one else could see. She glanced down at her smartwatch, pressed her thumb to the screen, and whispered under her breath, "Activate Plan B now." The message flashed across the encrypted app, sending a signal straight to Jamal Harris, her trusted assistant waiting nearby. In seconds, Jamal was on the move, reaching out to Lisa Chen, a director inside the parent company. Pieces were falling into place. No one in the lobby noticed the quiet click of a button. Emily thought she had won. Robert believed his authority was unquestioned. Guests thought they were watching an unfortunate incident soon to be forgotten. But Maya knew better. She knew that in 10 minutes, the same staff who mocked her would be fighting for their jobs. She knew the humiliation she endured would ignite something much bigger than a spat at the reception desk. She lifted her chin, looked Emily straight in the eye, and said quietly, "You'll regret this in 10 minutes." The words sent a ripple through the air. Emily blinked, unsettled for a moment, then laughed it off. "Sure I will," she scoffed, turning away. But Carlos froze. Sarah's recording caught every syllable, and the seeds of change had been planted. Mike Donovan, the hotel's head of security, walked into the lobby with heavy boots and a smirk that told everyone he enjoyed moments like these, his wide frame blocking the light as if his presence alone could silence the room. And without a second thought, he barked, "This guest is trespassing. Escort her out." The order cut through the air, and the atmosphere shifted. 40 pairs of eyes following his every move as if the verdict had already been sealed. Emily folded her arms with satisfaction. Robert adjusted his tie, and together they looked like a court handing down judgment. Maya, standing steady, offered the printed confirmation once more, her tone calm. "I have a reservation," but Robert waved his hand as if brushing away a fly. "She probably forged that booking," he sneered loudly, raising his voice so the crowd could hear. "Our database processed over 500 entries today, and none belong to her." Guests began whispering, some chuckling, a couple recording quietly with their phones, the humiliation spreading like a virus through the polished lobby. Mike stepped closer, his shadow falling over Maya, his breath sharp with authority. "Leave now," he said, his voice low and menacing, "or face arrest. We've had 12 such incidents this month, people trying to scam their way into luxury." His hand hovered near her arm as though ready to grab her, his posture daring her to resist. The gasps and murmurs grew, and Maya stood in the middle of the storm, her back straight, her face calm, her presence like a stone in a raging river. The pressure of his grip against her arm, though not yet applied, pulled Maya back into memories she thought she had long buried. She remembered Chicago, her 20s, the fundraiser she had been invited to attend at an upscale hotel, only to be dragged out by guards who claimed she looked like staff sneaking in for free food. The laughter of strangers that night echoed in her mind. The mocking comments about her cheap dress, the humiliation that clung to her even as she walked home alone in the cold. That wound had never truly healed, but it had hardened her resolve. She had turned pain into power, building an empire one brick at a time, swearing never again to bow to intimidation. Mike's looming presence now was not just a man in uniform, it was every gatekeeper who had ever tried to bar her from the places she built for herself. And she would not yield. Robert leaned over the counter, his lips curling into a mocking grin, and with deliberate arrogance he whispered to Emily while making sure Maya could hear. "Watch this," he said, slipping a white envelope across the desk to a man in a designer suit who had just approached. The man, clearly a wealthy guest, pressed a hand into Robert's, and a faint exchange of bills slid between them. Sarah Wilkins, standing at the edge of the crowd with her phone still raised, caught the entire exchange. Her camera captured the subtle handoff, the glint of money, the smirk Robert tried to hide. Emily laughed softly, turning to Mike. "Ignore her. Focus on our real guests." The wealthy man nodded toward Maya, muttering, "People like her ruin the atmosphere." The bile rose in Sarah's throat as she realized what was unfolding. She tapped her phone and quietly sent the video file across the room via Bluetooth, the small chime buzzing in Maya's smartwatch. Maya glanced down, her eyes catching the notification, and looked back at Sarah with a grateful nod. The evidence was in her hands now, and though she stood surrounded by mockery, she was armed. Mike stepped forward again, his voice booming across the lobby. "This is your final warning." He reached for Maya's arm, but she shifted slightly back, her voice calm yet firm. "Under Title II of the Civil Rights Act, you are denying service on discriminatory grounds. This will not stand." The words were sharp, legal, undeniable. Yet Emily rolled her eyes. Robert chuckled, and Mike smirked as if the law was nothing more than a game. "You're irrelevant here," Emily snapped, her tone almost gleeful in its cruelty. The guests murmured, some nodding with approval, others shaking their heads at the spectacle, but the power dynamic seemed unshakable. Maya, however, had anticipated this very moment. She tapped her smartwatch again, activating a hidden microphone that began recording every word. Her calm voice repeated the law, her words crisp, her intent clear. "This is a violation, and I am documenting it." Mike leaned closer, lowering his voice to a growl. "Document all you want. You'll be out that door in 2 minutes." But even as he spoke, the trap he couldn't see was closing around him. At that exact moment, Carlos Ramirez, seated nervously at the auxiliary desk in the corner, made his move. He had been trained in the hotel's internal systems, and though he was only an intern, he had discovered back doors in the software during his orientation. His heart pounded as he slipped a small flash drive into the port, opening a control panel that most managers didn't even know existed. With a few keystrokes, his hands shaking, he rerouted the sound system of the lobby. Robert's whispered words from minutes ago, the bribe, the envelope, the disdain. He had captured them through the microphone feed and now funneled them into the speakers overhead. Suddenly, the calm piano music that had been playing in the background cut off with a jarring silence. Then, Robert's voice blared out across the lobby, amplified, echoing against marble walls for every guest to hear. "Bump her for cash. Ignore her. She doesn't belong here." The lobby froze. Guests turned their heads upward, then back toward Robert, whose face drained of color in an instant. Emily's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face, and Mike's grip faltered as confusion spread through him. The wealthy guest who had slipped the bribe glanced around nervously, tugging at his collar, realizing his part in the scandal was now public. Sarah's phone caught everything, faces, reactions, disbelief. Gasps filled the air. followed by the unmistakable sound of dozens of phones being lifted, cameras flashing red lights as people began recording and live streaming. Robert stammered. That's taken out of context. But the damage was already irreversible. The audio continued, snippets of his sneers and Emily's mocking words playing like a confession they had never intended to make public. The guests, once complicit in silence, now erupted into murmurs of outrage. A woman shouted, "This is corruption," a man added. "Discrimination on full display." The tide of opinion shifted in seconds, and Maya, still calm in the center, knew the momentum was turning. She whispered to Sarah, her lips barely moving. "Keep recording." Sarah nodded, her phone steady, her voice quiet but resolute. "The world needs to see this." Emily pressed furiously at the computer, her fingers trembling, but the system would not respond. Carlos had locked her out. Mike barked, "Shut this down!" But his voice cracked under the pressure, his authority bleeding away with every second the audio filled the air. Robert's hands shook as he tried to unplug cables, but the voices kept playing, exposing more than they had ever intended. The crowd, once merely entertained by the humiliation of a stranger, now stood in judgment of the staff themselves. Phones streamed to social platforms, fingers typed hashtags, comments poured in live. Maya's smartwatch buzzed again, Jamal's coded message appearing on screen. "Phase 1 complete. Cameras everywhere. Stand firm." Maya straightened her shoulders and met Robert's terrified eyes. "You thought you had control," she said quietly. "But control has already slipped from your hands." He swallowed hard, his lips dry, but no words came. Emily muttered under her breath, "This isn't happening." Her arrogance crumbling into panic. Mike looked toward the guests, realizing too late that his threats carried no weight against an audience armed with cameras and fury. And still. Maya did not raise her voice, did not lash out. She simply stood, calm and centered. While chaos erupted around her, her silence was louder than their shouting, her presence heavier than their power, inside her mind. She knew this was only the beginning, a small step in the storm she had prepared to unleash. The humiliation had escalated, yes, but so had the exposure. What began as sneers and mockery was now recorded evidence, amplified for every ear in the room, and though Robert, Emily, and Mike still believed they could twist the narrative, Maya already knew the truth. The seeds of destruction had been sown, and the harvest of justice was coming fast. Mike Donovan's hand clamped down on Maya's arm at last, rough and forceful, dragging her toward the tall glass doors as if she were a criminal instead of a paying guest. His grip leaving no doubt about his intent as he barked to the crowd. "She's banned for life." Robert Klein's voice rose above the shocked murmurs, his tone dripping with mock authority as he shouted, "Out with her! She'll never step foot in Lux Inn again!" And Emily Thompson, standing proudly behind the counter, smirked with satisfaction, adding the final sting. "Go back to your level. This place is not for you." Their words echoed in the grand lobby, bouncing off marble walls and crystal chandeliers, carried on the air to 40 witnesses who gasped, whispered, and debated among themselves. Some clapped, approving of the staff's arrogance, while others shook their heads in quiet shame. Maya, dragged through the crowd, held her head high, her eyes unflinching, her silence heavier than their insults. Her body swayed under Mike's force, but her spirit remained rooted in defiance, a woman refusing to break even as humiliation reached its peak, as the cold grip of his hand pressed into her arm. A flood of memories rose again. Memories of Atlanta, her first job at a hotel front desk, when management had accused her of stealing cash from the register she had never touched. She remembered standing in the back office, being told she would never work in hospitality again. She remembered walking out into the humid night air, her dignity stripped, her future uncertain. Yet she vowed that evening never to let anyone dictate her worth again. She had climbed back, built quietly, amassed power silently, until she commanded a $2 billion empire that no one could see in this moment. Mike's rough treatment brought all of that back. But instead of shame, it filled her with steel. She knew this was the last time anyone would ever drag her like this. Before being shoved outside, Maya slipped her hand into her pocket and pressed a tiny USB into Sarah Wilkins's hand. Sarah's eyes widened, understanding the gravity, and Maya whispered only 2 words. "Upload this." Sarah nodded, determination replacing her shock. As Maya was pushed against the glass doors, her smartwatch buzzed once more, Jamal's coded message appearing, "Phase 2 ready." Maya's lips curled into the faintest smile. Even in humiliation, her strategy was unfolding exactly as planned. Sarah sprinted to the corner of the lobby, her phone trembling in her hands as she plugged in the USB. The files sprang open, recordings of Robert's bribes, Emily's slurs, Mike's threats, every word captured and organized. She tapped quickly, uploading the video to X, her fingers steady as she typed the caption, "Lux indiscriminates, proof inside." Within seconds, the post was live, the hashtag Lux indiscrimination blazing across the digital landscape. Carlos Ramirez, watching from his desk, joined the fight. He forwarded internal emails and logs to journalists he trusted, proof that management had been covering up such incidents for months. His heart pounded as he hit send. Knowing his career at Luxin was finished, but also knowing the truth had to see daylight. Back in the lobby, guests who had been recording began to stream live, broadcasting Maya's humiliation to thousands, then tens of thousands. Phones lit up with notifications, pings, and alerts. A teenage guest whispered, "It's blowing up already," showing his screen to others. By the time Maya's heels hit the pavement outside the hotel, Sarah's post had already gathered 10,000 shares. The video spreading like wildfire. People around the world saw Emily sneering, Robert pocketing cash, Mike manhandling a black woman who had done nothing but stand her ground. Outrage lit the internet like dry grass in a summer blaze. Maya stood just outside the doors, the cool Manhattan air hitting her face, and her phone vibrated violently in her pocket. She pulled it out to see the numbers climb in real time. 1 million views, then 10 million, then 20. Comments poured in. "This is disgusting. Boycott Luxin. Justice for Maya." Strangers from around the globe united in fury, their words flying faster than any press release could hope to contain. Within 3 minutes, the video crossed 75 million views. The hashtag #LuxIndiscrimination, trending #1 worldwide. CNN cut into programming with the headline, "Racial discrimination caught on camera at Lux in Manhattan." Fox News followed. Viral outrage as hotel staff accused of bias. MSNBC, local stations, bloggers, influencers. Every corner of media joined the storm. Inside the boardroom of Elite Hospitality's interim leadership, phones rang incessantly. The interim CEO shouted, "Contain this now!" But it was too late. Bookings evaporated as guests canceled en masse. 15,000 reservations were withdrawn in the first hour. 5 corporate partners suspended contracts worth millions. The stock ticker flashed red, shares plunging 22% in a single morning, wiping out $150 million in market value before Wall Street had even closed. The empire quaked, and all because of one act of arrogance that had underestimated the wrong woman. Yet outside, Maya remained composed. Jamal's voice came through her earpiece. "Phase 2 is active. Cameras are everywhere. The footage can't be silenced." Maya's reply was steady. "Good. Let them see." She turned her gaze back toward the glass doors, where Emily and Robert now stood pale and shaken, watching as guests turned their phones on them. Not Maya. Mike remained near the entrance, his arms stiff at his sides, realizing his threats carried no weight against the tidal wave of digital fury. Maya lifted her chin slightly, a queen who had been dragged but not dethroned, and her whisper carried like prophecy. This is only the beginning. Across the city, news anchors debated, activists called for accountability, and civil rights lawyers announced investigations. Commentators compared the scandal to infamous incidents of discrimination that had toppled corporations before. Protesters began gathering outside Lux Inn within the hour, chanting, carrying signs, live streaming the call for justice. Cars honked in solidarity, pedestrians joined. The hotel surrounded by the sound of voices rising. The once grand lobby that had echoed with sneers now echoed with shame. Robert tried to salvage control, sending frantic messages to corporate. We can say the video is fake. We can claim she was aggressive. But the evidence was too clear, the recordings too sharp, the witnesses too many. Emily, who had once sneered so confidently, now looked like a ghost of herself, clutching the counter, muttering, "She can't do this to us." Mike, pacing near the door, realized with dread that his face had been broadcast to 75 million people, his threats immortalized online. Their power crumbled not in silence, but in the roar of a world that demanded justice, and through it all. Maya never shouted, never cursed, never broke. Her dignity was her weapon. Her calm was her sword. She had been humiliated, yes, but humiliation turned to evidence. Evidence turned to outrage. Outrage turned to a storm that no corporation could weather, as Jamal's final message buzzed on her wrist. Phase 3 is waiting. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from victory yet, but from certainty. She knew the reckoning had only just begun. By the time the sun began to dip behind the Manhattan skyline, the firestorm had grown into a hurricane that no press release could stop, and inside the 32nd floor of Elite Hospitality Group's glass tower, the atmosphere was pure chaos. Phones ringing without pause, assistants rushing with papers, executives whispering about collapsing bookings and shareholder rage. The interim CEO, a man who had never faced a scandal of this scale, slammed his fist on the polished oak table and shouted, "We are bleeding! Contain this now!" His voice cracked with desperation as a junior analyst rushed in with the latest figures. 15,000 reservations canceled in a single afternoon. 5 major contracts suspended. Revenue losses of $2.5 million in just hours. And the stock down another 10% on top of the earlier collapse. A staggering $250 million in market value gone before the day had even closed. "We can't afford this," he barked, sweat forming on his brow. "This chain will collapse if we don't act." Across from him, Robert Klein sat pale and trembling, his confidence drained, trying to shift blame. "It was Emily," he muttered, voice cracking. "She mocked the guest. I tried to intervene." But others had already seen the videos, the audio, the money-changing hands. His excuses fell flat. "No," the interim CEO shot back. "You were caught taking bribes. The whole world saw it." Robert's lips quivered, but no words came. On the screen in the conference room, Emily appeared by video call, her face drawn and frightened. "They twisted my words," she pleaded. "It's not what it looked like." Yet even she knew her performance was futile. Her tone lacked the arrogance it once carried. The board of directors convened, 3 members taking their seats with stern expressions. David Patel, an Indian-American investor with decades of experience. Angela Ruiz, a Latina businesswoman with a reputation for cutting through spin. And Thomas Lee, a seasoned strategist whose patience was thin. "We are here to address an existential crisis," David said firmly. "This is not an isolated incident. This is systemic rot," Angela added. "The footage is undeniable. The backlash is global. The protests are already forming outside. This is not about one guest. It is about a culture that failed." Thomas leaned forward, his tone blunt. So who is going to take responsibility? Robert swallowed hard, his hands shaking. We can claim the video is fake, manipulated by competitors. Emily nodded quickly on her screen. Yes, yes. She was aggressive. She provoked us. But Angela's hand slammed against the table. Enough, she snapped. Do you think the public is blind? Do you think 75 million viewers imagined your sneers, your bribes, your threats? The denial is worse than the crime? Silence hung heavy in the room. For a moment, the interim CEO considered sacrificing Emily and Robert as scapegoats, but he knew it would not be enough. What no one in that boardroom knew was that Maya Johnson was already holding the strings. For years, she had kept her ownership quiet, buying shares through trusts, layering investments under different names, and ensuring her influence remained invisible until the moment was right. Years earlier, when this same interim CEO had dismissed her merger proposal as unrealistic, claiming she lacked the stature to play in their league, Maya had smiled politely, walked out of the room, and then quietly bought controlling stakes until she owned 60% of Elite Hospitality. That rejection had been the fuel for her rise, and now it was the foundation of her dominance. In her downtown apartment, she typed a short email, attaching a single file, and sent it directly to the board's secure channel. The subject line read simply, "Meeting in 1 hour." The body of the email was sharper. "Ignore this request, and your chain collapses tonight." Within minutes, the directors' phones buzzed, their faces turned pale, and the interim CEO whispered, "Who does she think she is?" But Angela's eyes narrowed, her instincts sharp. "Whoever she is, we can't afford to ignore her." Meanwhile, in a quiet office 2 floors below, Lisa Chen, a trusted executive and longtime ally of Maya, leaned back in her chair with a smirk. Months earlier, under the guise of an internal audit, she had installed monitoring software across Luxin's financial systems. The program flagged irregularities, traced transactions, and built a map of corruption, and by now, it had logged over 200 questionable payments tied to Robert Klein, bribes, kickbacks, fraudulent upgrades, more than $1.2 million stolen from the chain's veins. Lisa forwarded the data directly to Maya's secure server. A message appeared on Maya's screen. "Evidence ready." Maya typed back 2 words. "Send board." Moments later, the director's tablets lit up with a flood of damning transactions. Every dollar marked, every recipient listed. David Patel's jaw tightened as he scrolled. Angela muttered, "Unbelievable," and Thomas shook his head, whispering, "This isn't negligence, this is theft." The weight of the evidence fell like an avalanche. The interim CEO's voice cracked as he read line after line. "This could bankrupt us if it goes public," Robert stammered. "That data is fabricated." But the timestamps, bank logs, and receipts were undeniable. His protests sounded pathetic against the mountain of proof. Emily, still on the video call, looked at him with horror, realizing she was tethered to a sinking ship. Mike Donovan paced outside the boardroom doors, his face drenched in sweat, knowing his part in the scandal was no less toxic. Inside, panic turned into dread, dread turned into resignation, and resignation opened the door for Maya's entrance. Across the city, she closed her laptop, slid her blazer over her shoulders, and stood with calm determination. The storm had raged all day, but now it was time for the reckoning to move from the lobby and the internet into the boardroom itself. She whispered to Jamal, who stood ready by her side. "They wanted me gone. Now they'll have to face me." Her voice was steady, her presence unshaken. The chessboard was hers, and the next move would topple the pieces that thought themselves untouchable. The boardroom of Elite Hospitality's New York Tower fell into a heavy silence as the glass doors swung open. and in walked Maya Johnson. No longer the weary traveler mocked in the lobby, but a woman in control. Her blazer sharp, her posture straight, her gaze calm yet unyielding. And beside her trailed Jamal Harris carrying a slim briefcase and Lisa Chen with a quiet confidence that hinted at the storm about to break. Robert Klein jumped to his feet, color draining from his face as if he had seen a ghost. "You? What are you doing here?" Emily's voice crackled through the speakerphone, a nervous tremor betraying her as she stammered. "That's the woman who caused this mess. She's the fraud." Mike Donovan, pacing outside, stopped dead in his tracks, pressing his ear to the door, his jaw tight, waiting for his name to surface. Maya did not rush. She walked slowly to the head of the table, placed her hands firmly on the polished oak, and said with a steady voice, "Fire Emily Thompson, Robert Klein, Mike Donovan, and every one of the 147 employees who enabled them, or I will dismantle Luxin before this night is over." Gasps rippled through the room, disbelief flickering across the board's faces, and Robert let out a bitter laugh, his last shred of arrogance clinging to him like a mask. "You're bluffing," he sneered. "You're nothing but a guest with a grudge." His words barely faded before Lisa Chen pressed a button on the remote, and the screen behind her lit up with a cascade of evidence. Transaction after transaction of Robert's corruption, dates, bank transfers, names of clients, every bribe he had pocketed. David Patel leaned forward, his jaw tightening. $1.2 million, he muttered. All stolen through abuse of power. Angela Ruiz shook her head in disgust. "And you dared to sit here and point fingers at others." Robert lunged forward, grabbing at the papers. But Jamal slid the briefcase open and dropped printed files across the table, each one stamped and verified. "Fabrications!" Robert screamed, but the evidence was too precise, too detailed, too damning to deny. Emily's voice broke over the speakerphone. I didn't know." But her earlier sneers echoed through every guest's memory and every viral video, her protests meaningless now. The interim CEO, sweating heavily, finally muttered, "We have no choice." But Maya wasn't finished. She straightened and looked directly into Robert's hollow eyes. "You thought you could humiliate me in front of strangers. You thought power was yours to abuse. But today, you face the consequences." Robert slumped into his chair, his smirk gone, his voice a broken whisper. "Impossible." Angela turned to the interim CEO and spoke with authority. "Effective immediately, terminate Robert Klein, Emily Thompson, and Mike Donovan, publicly, decisively." The gavel fell not with wood, but with silence, the sound of reputations shattering. Outside. Mike pressed his back against the wall, sliding to the floor as his world collapsed, the words he dreaded echoing through the heavy doors. Then David Patel turned to Maya, his tone sharp but curious. "You speak with authority, but who are you to make such demands?" The room leaned in, breaths held, silence taut like a wire. Maya allowed the pause to stretch, her eyes moving across each face. Then, with deliberate calm, she said, "I am Maya Johnson, Chief Executive Officer of Elite Hospitality Group. I own 75% of Lux Inn." The shock that followed was unlike any that had come before. Jaws dropped, eyes widened, and the interim CEO collapsed back into his chair as if struck. "That's not possible," he whispered. "We would have known." Maya's lips curved into the faintest smile. "You dismissed me years ago, said I lacked stature, so I bought you. Quietly, layer by layer, until your empire was mine. You didn't notice because arrogance blinds more than darkness ever could." Her words carried the weight of history, of every prejudice that had once dismissed her. And now, her revelation landed like thunder. Emily's voice broke through the speaker, shrill and desperate. "She's lying. This can't be true." But David Patel raised his hand sharply. "Silence," he ordered. "This woman owns us, and we didn't even see it," Angela whispered. "Brilliant," while Thomas Lee nodded slowly. "Calculated and undeniable." Robert clutched his head in his hands, muttering. "All this time, she was above us," the interim CEO sputtered. "If you are truly the CEO, what do you want?" Maya leaned closer, her voice quiet but sharper than steel. "I want accountability, I want reform, and I want every corrupt thread torn from this chain." But she was not done. With a tap of her finger, the screen behind her flickered, and a new face appeared. The CEO of Premier Stays, Elite Hospitality's fiercest rival, joining by live video. His voice was smooth, his smile cutting. "We stand with Maya Johnson," he said, "and in 12 hours, we can acquire Luxin's contracts, technology, and properties outright unless her terms are met." Gasps filled the boardroom once more, the directors exchanging horrified glances. David Patel whispered, "A hostile takeover," while Thomas Lee muttered, "Or a shutdown." The Premier Stays CEO continued, "Your brand is already collapsing, your stock plunging, your reputation destroyed. Without Maya's leadership, you will not survive." The alliance was clear. Maya had secured leverage not only inside Elite Hospitality, but outside, holding in her hands the power to either destroy or transform the company. Angela leaned forward, her voice firm. "Then we comply. We cut out the rot, rebuild under her vision, or we lose everything." David nodded gravely. "It's not a choice. It's survival." Robert rose from his chair, desperation in his eyes. "You can't let her do this. She's betraying us to competitors." But Maya silenced him with one glance. "Betrayal?" she repeated softly. "You betrayed this company long before I arrived, when you sold dignity for cash and mocked loyalty as weakness. Today, betrayal ends." Her words dropped like a gavel, final and inescapable. The interim CEO, broken, finally whispered, "What are your terms?" Maya straightened, her voice measured. "Immediate termination of Robert Klein, Emily Thompson, and Mike Donovan. A public apology to every guest wronged. New training for every employee, from front desk to boardroom, and full implementation of reforms I will announce tomorrow. Deny me, and Premier Stays owns you by dawn." The silence that followed was heavy with resignation. At last, David Patel spoke. "Motion carried," Angela Ruiz added, "effective immediately." Thomas Lee closed his eyes, then opened them with resolve. "So be it." The board's decision was sealed. Robert collapsed into his chair, his face pale as paper, whispering. "This isn't happening," Emily sobbed into her microphone. "Please, don't end my career." Mike, outside the door, sank into his seat, burying his head in his hands. But Maya remained steady, her eyes clear, her presence immovable. She had been mocked, dragged, humiliated. But now, she stood revealed as the very power they had underestimated. The reckoning had come, not with shouting or rage, but with calm, relentless truth. The morning after the boardroom confrontation, the press gathered outside Luxin Manhattan, cameras flashing as the doors opened, and Maya Johnson stepped onto the marble steps. No longer a humiliated guest, but the undisputed leader of Elite Hospitality. Her voice calm yet commanding as she announced the beginning of reforms that would reshape not only Luxin, but the entire hotel industry. "Effective immediately," she declared. "Every employee across our 5,000 staff will undergo anti-discrimination training. From the receptionist who greets guests to the executives who sign contracts, we will not tolerate prejudice in any corner of this chain." Reporters scribbled furiously as she continued. "We are launching a transparent monthly report that will track and publish every complaint of bias, and we will be accountable to the public we serve." Behind her stood Lisa Chen, Jamal Harris, and even Carlos Ramirez, the young intern who had risked his future to expose corruption. Maya gestured toward him and said, "Courage is not found only in boardrooms, it is found in those who refuse to stay silent." The crowd cheered. The cameras captured his shy nod. And in that moment, Carlos became the symbol of a new era, inside the chain. Skepticism rippled at first, staff whispering about whether these changes would last. But Maya pressed forward with relentless speed. Within weeks, workshops were held in every property, mandatory sessions where employees confronted their own biases, discussed dignity, and learned that service was not just about luxury, but about respect. At first, some resisted, whispering complaints about new rules and corporate slogans. But as guests returned with praise, writing reviews about being treated with fairness and warmth, attitudes began to shift. The numbers spoke louder than resistance. Bookings rose by 20,000 in a single quarter. Revenue climbed 30%, and the brand that had been sinking in scandal began to shine as a model of redemption. But Maya was not content with training alone. She knew prejudice was not only personal, but systemic, and systems required new tools. So, she unveiled what she called FairStay, an artificial intelligence platform designed to monitor hotel interactions in real time. FairStay will review guest feedback, scan for patterns of bias, and ensure that every customer, regardless of appearance, accent, or background, receives equal treatment, Maya explained at the launch event. Her words carried live on national television. The idea was radical. Technology not as a barrier, but as a guardian of fairness. FairStay would be deployed first in Luxin's American hotels, then expanded to 500 properties worldwide. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some praised the innovation as overdue, others feared surveillance and exposure. But Maya anticipated this and made her vision clear. This is not about watching people. This is about watching out for people. Fairness must be proven, not promised. The twist that shook the industry came only days later. Major chains that had long competed with Luxin, Hilton, Marriott, Hyatt, were faced with a choice: join the FairStay initiative or risk being seen as lagging behind. Investors pressured them, guests demanded it, activists called for it, slowly, then suddenly. The tide turned. Hilton signed first, agreeing to integrate FairStay across its U.S. properties. Marriott followed, announcing a pilot program. Even those who initially resisted realized they could not afford to ignore the shift. By the end of the quarter, half the industry was either adopting FairStay or negotiating with Maya's team, effectively making her platform the new standard. What began as a response to humiliation in a lobby had transformed into a global movement. One woman's defiance rewriting the rules of hospitality. Back at Luxin Manhattan, the staff who had once mocked Maya now walked past a plaque at the entrance engraved with new words: "Service is not privilege, it is humanity." Guests paused to take photos, posting them online with messages of hope. Sarah Wilkins, the traveler who had recorded the first videos, became an informal ambassador, traveling to conferences to share the story of what she witnessed. Carlos, promoted from intern to project leader, oversaw the rollout of FairStay training, mentoring hundreds of employees and reminding them that courage had consequences. Jamal, once her quiet assistant, now stood as her right hand in every public event, the steady presence who had activated Plan B on that fateful night. And Maya, though praised by media as a visionary, carried herself with humility, reminding everyone, "This was never about me. It was about justice." The industry was forever altered. Analysts marveled at the turnaround. From a chain that had lost hundreds of millions to one that now set the pace of reform. Social media, once ablaze with anger, now buzzed with praise, hashtags shifting from hashtag #LuxInDiscrimination to hashtag #FairStay. Guests posted about being welcomed without judgment, about staff who smiled without suspicion, about a company that had become a leader not by accident, but by accountability. For Maya, this was more than redemption for a brand. It was a legacy forged from humiliation into transformation. A reminder that dignity could not be denied, only delayed, and that fairness, once demanded, could spread like fire. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained, reshaping lives long after the cameras moved on. And for those who had once mocked Maya Johnson, the consequences arrived like shadows that never left. Emily Thompson, the receptionist whose sneer had lit the first spark, found herself dismissed not only from Luxin, but from nearly every hospitality group in the country. Her name whispered as a warning in industry circles. Her job applications returned unanswered, and her once proud demeanor replaced by the quiet look of someone shunned by the very world she once believed she controlled. Robert Klein, the manager who had pocketed bribes with arrogance, was stripped of his title, his finances exposed, his reputation shredded, desperate to work. He took a position as a janitor in a small motel on the outskirts of New Jersey, each sweep of his broom a reminder that corruption had dragged him lower than any enemy could. Mike Donovan, the security guard who had gripped Maya's arm with the force of power abused, could not escape the viral videos. Everywhere he went, people recognized his face, some pointing, others whispering, a few confronting him directly. "You're the one who dragged that woman." He tried to live quietly, but the weight of shame pressed on him like an unrelenting burden. Yet Maya, despite all she endured, chose a path not of vengeance but of reform. She announced the launch of the Second Chance program, a bold initiative to retrain 500 dismissed hospitality workers, giving them tools to rebuild careers and teaching them that dignity could be relearned. Shock rippled when it was revealed that Emily herself had applied, her arrogance stripped away, her letter of admission filled with regret. Maya allowed her in, not out of weakness, but out of conviction, proving that justice was not revenge, but transformation. Carlos Ramirez, once an intern hiding behind a corner desk, now stood as the program's lead coordinator, guiding former offenders, inspiring 10,000 others across the industry. His story reminding them that courage could change everything. As Luxin rose from its ashes, its redemption became a symbol not only of survival, but of leadership. Within a year, the chain earned the 8AA Award for Best Inclusive Hospitality Brand, a recognition once thought impossible, and bookings surged as guests from all walks of life flocked to its doors, eager to support a company that had turned scandal into strength. Reporters marveled at the turnaround, analysts praised Maya's vision, and employees spoke proudly of working in an environment where bias was not just discouraged, but rooted out. Sarah Wilkins, the traveler whose phone had captured the first cruel words, found herself invited to panels and conferences. Her quiet act of recording elevated into a movement. She reminded audiences, "I didn't plan to be a hero. I just couldn't stay silent." Her words resonated, proving that change often begins with ordinary people refusing to look away. But Maya was not done. In a press conference that filled every news channel, she announced the creation of Stay Equal, a global fund dedicated to supporting 10,000 victims of discrimination in hospitality, providing legal aid, financial compensation, and pathways to justice. The room erupted in applause as she explained, "No one should endure what I endured. No one should be humiliated in the very place they paid to belong." Donations poured in, investors pledged millions, and within months, Stay Equal had become a force beyond her own company, a beacon for fairness across the globe. The final twist lay in her quiet revelation. She had seeded the fund with $50 million of her own fortune, not as charity, but as duty, ensuring that the fight against bias would outlast her. For the board of elite hospitality, the transformation was humbling, David Patel admitted publicly. We failed to see what was right in front of us. It took Maya to remind us that leadership is not about profit, but about principle. Angela Ruiz spearheaded new oversight committees. Thomas Lee restructured hiring pipelines. And together, they pledged never again to let arrogance blind their vision. Jamal Harris, who had once stood quietly in Maya's shadow, now stepped into the spotlight as her chief of staff, his loyalty and precision recognized by all. And Lisa Chen, who had exposed Robert's financial crimes, became a vice president, leading compliance with an iron will and a compassionate heart. The world looked at Maya Johnson not just as a CEO, but as a symbol of resilience. She had entered Lux Inn as a guest denied service, mocked and dragged. Yet she emerged as the architect of change, turning humiliation into reform, and reform into legacy. In interviews, she never boasted, never gloated. Instead, she said simply, "Justice is not revenge. Justice is progress. When we stand firm, when we refuse to break, we change not just ourselves but the systems around us." Her words became a mantra, repeated in classrooms, quoted in newspapers, etched into speeches, and for those who once doubted her. Redemption was still possible. Emily, humbled and working through the Second Chance program, stood before a classroom of trainees months later and admitted, "I once thought kindness was weakness. I was wrong. I was blind. Maya gave me another chance, and I will spend the rest of my life proving I can change." Her voice trembled, but her sincerity was clear, and the room applauded, not out of sympathy but respect. Even Robert, sweeping floors in obscurity, began attending night classes, inspired not by punishment, but by the possibility of rebuilding. Mike lived quietly, volunteering at a shelter, telling young men, "Don't let pride make you cruel. I learned the hardest way." Maya's story closed not with her alone, but with a movement she had ignited, a world altered by her defiance, a legacy carved in stone. The plaque at Lux Inn's entrance, polished each morning, carried her final message: dignity is not granted, it is inherent, and we will honor it in every guest, every time. And those who passed through those doors, whether wealthy or weary, whether dressed in designer suits or simple jeans, felt the weight of those words. Because one woman had stood firm, had refused humiliation, and had turned injustice into a revolution that spread across industries and continents. Thank you for watching this story. Where are you watching from today? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched you, please subscribe and give it a like so more people can hear stories of justice and hope.